There is a loophole in the first rule, and it is regarding the prevailing wages. In most cases, the prevailing wage is set too low. Most of the companies can legally pay their H1B workers around $60,000, but the problem is Americans in the software field earn far more than that. So companies have an incentive to replace Americans with low earning H1B workers. So in these four rules that we saw, there is nothing in these rules that says an American worker should not be replaced by a H1B worker, or that the company has to first try to hire an American for the same job. These rules were first formulated in 1990, and by 1998, the US government started to notice that a lot of companies were replacing American workers with H1B workers, so they introduced new and additional protections for the US worker. These protections or rules these protections or rules were also full of loopholes, but let's first see what these rules or protections were. These additional protections for the US worker are in the form of something called as a H1B dependent employer. Now, a H1B dependent employer is one where more than 15% of the workforce is comprised of H1B workers. Clearly, such a employer is dependent on H1B workers for his business. There are additional rules if a H1B dependent employer needs to apply for a H1B visa. Let's look at what these additional rules are. The first rule is regarding non-displacement of US workers. A H1B dependent employer is not allowed to replace American workers with H1B workers. The second rule is that the H1B dependent employer is not allowed to indirectly replace American workers with H1B workers. Indirect displacement is what happens when one company sends its H1B workers to another company, and the other company replaces its American workers with the supplied H1B workers. This is called indirect displacement, and a H1B dependent employer is not allowed to do this. The third rule states that um, before a H1B dependent employer applies for a H1B visa, he is supposed to have searched and failed to find an American for the same job. Evidence of the attempt to hire an American worker is required. There is a loophole in the above rules that allows even a H1B dependent employer to bypass these rules. The loophole is in the form of something called an exempt H1B candidate. If a H1B dependent employer has applied a H1B visa for an exempt H1B candidate, then the employer does not have to follow the rules mentioned above. Now let's see what an exempt H1B candidate is. An exempt H1B candidate is one who does not earn more than $60,000 per year or who has a master's degree. In other words, if a H1B dependent employer applies a H1B visa for a candidate who earns more than $60,000 per year or who has a master's degree, then the H1B dependent employer can replace an American worker directly with this H1B, can replace an American worker indirectly, and it does not even have to try to hire an American before applying for this H1B worker. Now you might be thinking what the logic behind the exempt H1B candidate is. I'm not too sure either, but I have some data that might help explain why this concept of H1B exempt was created. This concept was first created in 1998, and the median wage for software professionals in 1998 was $50,000 to $60,000 per year. This meant that 50% of the people earned less than $60,000 and 50% of the people earned more than $60,000 possibly the experienced ones earned more than $60,000. So, with the arrival of the H1B worker, the people who earned more than $60,000 would be affected, but the people who earned less than that would not be affected. You have to compare this to the present situation where the median wage is between $80 to $100,000 per year. I don't think there is any software professional in America these days who earns around $60,000. So these days, 100% of the American workers are affected with the arrival of the H1B worker because the H1B workers earn $60,000 and most of the Americans earn far more than that. So in 1998, far fewer Americans were affected with the arrival of the H1B worker than it is today. So in 1998, the American government protected some of the workers, American workers, and they also made the software lobby happy by giving them the H1B visa. And they knew that by doing this, there won't be a lot of noise in the media because not a lot of people would be affected. But these days, a lot of people are affected, and there's a lot of noise about it, and there is pressure on the government to do something about the situation because a lot more people are affected today than in 1998. So I think this was the logic behind the exempt H1B to keep the software lobby happy and also to keep some of the workers protected, especially the ones who earned less than $60,000 per year.